Once upon a time in the 19th century, a guy named Percival Lowell, pacifist, opponent of religion, and popularizer of very bad science, we have plenty of them around these days, looked through his telescope at Mars, and what did he think he saw? What he thought he saw were ancient canals on Mars. And of course, he immediately decided these ancient canals represent an ancient Martian, dying Martian race, which is hoarding the remaining water in the canals. What he was actually seeing was a tiny webwork that was entirely on his end and had nothing to do with Mars. But that's how stupid ideas are born. This particular stupid idea, or ridiculous idea if you like, helped birth American science fiction from A Princess of Mars to Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles, but it had an even bigger impact on American politics and the way we live now in terms of so-called climate change. Because where did this ridiculous idea that, well, there must be an ancient race on Mars that is clinging to its water come from? Well, it came from a reevaluation in the 19th century of what the planets were in ancient eras. The Romans and the Greeks would name them after gods. They would see them as having astrological portents, and astrology continues to be popular until today. But in the 19th century, we thought we went through this revival, through this rational approach. Now, when people say that they are being rational, very often they are rationalizing. So what they actually did with the planets was create a new mythology. This new mythology was that, well, there are other aliens on Venus and on Mars, and that Venus and Mars are versions of Earth, because when we often look at something, what we really see is ourselves reflected back. That is just human nature. And when we looked at Mars and Venus with this new scientific perspective, what they thought at the time was that, well, Mars and Venus were once like Earth. Then Mars became very cold, it lost its water, and Venus became very, very hot, which is where the idea of the greenhouse effect comes from. Now, if you recall, before they rebranded climate change before they rebranded global warming as climate change, and before there was this whole flirtation with the ice age, you had the greenhouse effect. The Earth is suffering from a runaway greenhouse effect. Where did the idea come from? It came from Venus. It came from the idea that Venus was like a greenhouse. It kept all the heat in, and thus it became way too hot. In fact, once we actually sent probes pretty close to Venus, we found out that is completely not true. That is, the Venus has no parallels to Earth. It is not in any way is so very different. Mars is always similar to Earth. Venus has no parallels to Earth. It is completely different. But the idea stuck. Once you get a bad idea injected into the veins of a society, it is really hard to get rid of it. The greenhouse effect, the idea that Mars and Venus provided some sort of guidance for us, the actual science of it, nobody would seriously defend today. Nobody would seriously say, well, there are canals on Mars, that it probably was populated by an ancient race, and that, it has important lessons for Earth, let alone about Venus, which was completely disproven. Though back in the day, Carl Sagan, the great science popularizer, in some ways the successor of Percival Lowell, pushed the idea. But today, nobody would seriously defend it. We've spent enough time studying both Mars and Venus to know that's nonsense. But we still apply that same broken analogy to Earth, where we insist that Earth could go one way or the other. In fact, the idea that Earth is going to go one way or the other is completely wrong. The Earth goes through cycles. We know what those cycles are. And when we deny those cycles, it becomes rather absurd. But the premise of all this was that these ancient Martian or Venusian races had failed to deal with their climate problem, and we were about to go their way. And to a certain subset, what was the climate problem? The climate problem was industrialization, it was capitalism. We'd spent all this time on capitalism, on building things up, on building factories, and they just generalized, look how polluted London is, look how polluted New York is, or Chicago, and the whole planet is going to go this way. Of course, this was a false generalization. It was absurd because the sheer scale of the planet defies anything we could do to it. We have no ability to change the temperature of the planet. It's absurd to even think on that scale. Nonetheless, this has become dogma. And when there is dogma, well, the science will follow. The science, of course, meaning people who find career opportunities and profits in propping up whatever ridiculous myth, whatever thing we want to believe about the world. And what the left wants to believe about the world is that we can absolutely change it over, we can remake it, we can transform it, and now what we're doing is actively destroying the planet. Now they've jettisoned the Percival Lowell stuff, though Lowell has a crater named after him on the moon. They've jettisoned some of the manifest space alien absurdity, but the origins of climate change lie in science fiction. They lie in this idea that Mars and Venus were once like Earth, and that Earth is going to go the way of Mars and Venus. Even when nobody actually says that anymore, they still believe it. Because it's really hard to get rid of a bad idea, and the bad idea is transforming our society. It's stealing trillions of dollars out of our economy. It's devastating our ability to build anything. Uh, New York City was going to construct an air train to LaGuardia Airport. Anybody who flies into LaGuardia Airport knows how miserable it is. New York is no longer constructing that because of endless lawsuits by environmental groups about environmental reviews. So now you can't build an air train and you can't get easily back and forth from the airport. This is not just happening in New York, it's happening across the country. Biden, like Obama, has gone over to a particular bridge that crosses between Kentucky and Ohio, and has gone on. How about we're going to use infrastructure money to build replace the bridge? The bridge has gone through endless environmental reviews. They can't replace it because of the environmental reviews. This is what happens when you believe in absurd ideas, and those absurd ideas take over society as a whole. And it's crippling our ability to advance, to make any kind of progress into the future. And while we're not going to go the way of Mars and Venus, if we can't actually build infrastructure, if we can't construct anything, then we'll have no future.